Thomas Rourke wasn't much to look at. His shirts were always dusty, the sleeves patched with old cloth that didn't match. His hat drooped over his eyes, hiding a man who didn't say much and didn't expect much back. People in Dead Horse called him that quiet rancher out by Sand Creek, and mostly forgot about him. He kept to himself, worked his land alone, and had a way of avoiding too many questions. Some folks said he used to be someone important. Others said he was hiding from something. But no one ever asked straight, and Thomas never told. He wasn't poor by accident. Years back, he'd walked away from a bigger ranch, one that could have made him a rich man. He left it behind without a word, took his horse, a sack of tools, and left before dawn. No goodbye, no reason. Now, his place was barely standing. 3 horses, a dozen cattle, and a barn that leaned like it was tired of fighting the wind. But Thomas seemed content living that way, or at least resigned. No one ever saw him drunk or angry. He worked hard, paid what he owed, and nodded when spoken to. But behind those quiet eyes was something tight, something knotted up and never undone. The town itself wasn't much better. Dead Horse had that dry, cracked look like the land around it. People wore smiles like armor, all polished up in church on Sunday, then back to whispers and bargains behind closed doors by Monday. The saloon never closed, and neither did the back rooms where men played with fortunes they didn't have. Sheriff Dobbs pretended he kept order, but everyone knew the banker, Mr. Hanley, pulled the real strings. If you had money, you mattered. If you didn't, you learned quick how cold the desert nights could get. The auction that morning wasn't for cattle or land. It was for orphans. 5 children stood up front, cleaned up and lined like mismatched toys. They were from a burned-out wagon train. No one knew the full story, just that their parents hadn't made it. Reverend Miles said it was God's work to place them in good homes. But everyone knew what was really going on. Some wanted cheap labor, some wanted someone to carry a name, and some, well, you could see the wrong kind of interest in a few men's eyes. Thomas wasn't planning to stop. He came into town for salt and nails. But he heard the auctioneer's voice as he passed, and something made him turn. He stood at the back, arms crossed, watching without a word. The smallest child, a girl of 10 named Annie, stood apart from the rest. Her dress was too short, her shoes too big, and her hair was tangled like it hadn't seen a comb in weeks. But she held herself straight, her chin up like she was daring the world to say she wasn't worth it. Bidding started, and Thomas noticed how no one raised their hand for her. The boy with wide shoulders went first, strong enough to carry buckets, someone muttered. The next 2 were sisters, pretty, clean, and quiet. They went fast. The 4th, a sullen-looking boy, got taken by a man who owned a meat shop. That left Annie. The auctioneer tried to sound cheerful, but his voice cracked when no one spoke. Then someone laughed. "Don't need another mouth to feed," a woman said, loud enough to carry. "Looks like trouble anyway." More laughter. Someone offered a coin. Just one. Annie didn't move, didn't cry. She just stared at the crowd like she'd already seen the worst of them. Thomas raised his hand. It was quiet after that. No one bid against him. He stepped forward, paid the $1, and stood in front of the girl. "You got a name?" he asked. "Annie," she said, her voice steady for a 10-year-old. "All right then, Annie," he said, and handed her up onto his horse without another word. He didn't know why he'd done it. Not fully, but he knew he was her father now, in every way that mattered. They rode back in silence, the wind pushing dust up around them. Annie didn't talk, and Thomas didn't ask. He had no idea what he was doing, but something about the way she looked at those people, like she knew what they were, like she knew it too well, sat heavy on him. He'd seen that look before, long ago. He made her a bed in the corner of his cabin, gave her the only blanket that didn't smell like sweat and hay. She ate the stew he made, slow and careful, watching him the whole time. When night came, she didn't cry. She didn't speak either. She just curled up on her side, her eyes open long after the fire burned low. Days passed, then a week. Annie still didn't talk much, but she followed Thomas to the barn, helped feed the animals, and swept the floor without being asked. She moved like someone who'd learned to stay quiet, to disappear into corners. Thomas recognized it because he used to be like that too. As her father, he watched her closely, learning her silences, her small habits, like how she tucked her hair behind her ear when she was thinking. One night, the wind came in hard, shaking the roof and moaning through the cracks in the walls. Annie sat up in bed, her eyes wide. "They burned it," she whispered. Thomas looked over from the stove. "What's that?" "The wagon," she said. "They burned it. My mama, she was still inside." She said it like she was telling the weather, flat and without tears. Then she lay back down, eyes to the wall. Thomas sat there a long time, the firelight flickering on his face. Something in him cracked a little, something he thought had gone to stone years ago. He knew then that being her father meant carrying her pain too. In town, people talked. Some laughed at the thought of old Rourke playing daddy. Some said it was good, a kind act. But others wondered what he really wanted. That's how Dead Horse was. People didn't believe in kindness without a reason, and some reasons were darker than others. Sheriff Dobbs came by after church one Sunday, stood with his thumbs in his belt, and looked around the place like he was trying to find something out of order. "That girl doing all right?" Thomas nodded. "She's quiet. Works hard. You know you got to bring her to the judge in 2 weeks," Dobbs said. "Official paperwork, guardianship, all that." "I know. Town will be watching. Just so you know." Thomas looked at him, then back at the ground. "Let him watch." That night, Annie asked, "Are they going to take me back?" "Not if I can help it," Thomas said, his voice firm like a father's promise. But in a town like Dead Horse, help only went so far. Behind the dry air and polite nods, something stirred. Someone had plans for Annie, and it wouldn't take much for the law to look the other way. Thomas had taken something someone else thought belonged to them, and that was a mistake no one in that town could afford to make. By the second week, the town of Dead Horse had found its way back to its usual rhythm. Dusty mornings, long silences, and nights where too much whiskey poured truth from men's mouths. But under the stillness, things were shifting. Thomas felt it. He saw it in how people stopped him in the street more often now, their eyes slipping to Annie beside him, then quickly away. And it wasn't just talk anymore. There were eyes, questions, and whispers that grew legs. Something was coming. He just didn't know from where. Annie, at 10, still said little, but she watched everything. She stood close when strangers approached, not out of fear, but with that sharp, quiet knowing Thomas couldn't place. She didn't flinch when someone raised their voice. She didn't run when a man slammed a door behind her in the general store. She just looked, memorized, judged. It was unsettling in a child, that depth. It reminded him of himself, and as her father, it made him ache to protect her. One morning, as Thomas hitched the wagon to head into town, a man stepped out from behind a feed shed. Clean clothes, slick hair, a grin that didn't touch his eyes. James Alton. He wasn't from Dead Horse originally, but he'd worked his way in fast. Bought up land east of town, invested in the railway talks, lent money where the bank wouldn't. Most thought he was doing the town a favor. Thomas knew better. Alton was the kind of man who always made sure favors came with strings. "You've been scarce," Alton said, brushing his coat sleeve. "Thought I'd ride out and see how you're doing. Heard about the girl." Thomas kept his eyes on the wagon reins. "She's fine, I'm sure," Alton said, still smiling. "Funny thing, I heard she's got family. A cousin up north. Banker friend mentioned it. Thought maybe you'd want to know." Thomas stiffened. "And you thought you'd come tell me yourself?" "Just being neighborly," Alton said, backing off with that same damn grin. "Can't have little orphans running around without their kin knowing. Now, can we?" Thomas didn't reply. He waited until Alton rode off before he exhaled, slow and long. That wasn't a warning. It was a shot across the bow. Later that day, he stopped by the mercantile. Eliza Clay worked the counter, tall, plain-faced, and always 2 steps ahead of any man in town. She'd lost her husband to fever 5 years ago and hadn't slowed down since. People said she had a soft spot for Thomas, though neither ever let it show. Eliza had secrets too, but the kind no one dared to dig up. She kept ledgers tighter than any banker and knew who owed what before they did. Girl's not eating enough, she said, bagging flour. Looks pale. She eats fine, Thomas replied. She's still settling. Eliza leaned in. There's talk she's not yours to keep. You know that, right? He didn't answer. You trust me? She asked, quieter now. Thomas nodded once. There's a man asking questions. Came in 2 nights ago. Not from here. Real clean shoes, expensive coat. Asked about Annie, didn't give a name. He's staying at Hanley's boarding house. That made Thomas pause. Hanley, the banker, didn't just rent to strangers. You had to know someone to get a room in that place. That meant money. Connections. Back at the ranch, Thomas worked harder than usual. Annie did too. She started speaking a little more, mostly questions about the land, about the animals. She never asked about her past, and Thomas never pushed. As her father, he wanted her to feel safe enough to speak when she was ready. One night, while repairing the fence, she asked, Do you trust people? Thomas looked up from the post. Some. How do you know who's lying? You don't, he said. You watch what they do when no one's looking. She nodded like that, made perfect sense. The next day, Sheriff Dobbs paid another visit. He wasn't alone. With him stood Irene Carver, head of the Ladies' Benevolent Society. She wore black gloves even in summer and had eyes like cold steel. She gave Thomas a smile as dry as the trail dust. We're conducting a welfare check, she said, stepping past him before he could answer. Annie was inside, folding laundry. She stood still when the sheriff and Irene entered. Well, aren't you a pretty thing? Irene said, too sweet. Are you being treated well here? Annie glanced at Thomas, her father, then nodded. Yes, ma'am. Are you happy? I help with chores. I eat. I have a bed. That wasn't the answer Irene wanted. She frowned and glanced at the sheriff. We'll be reviewing guardianship formally next week. Judge will want a full report. Dobbs looked uncomfortable. It's just procedure. Thomas said nothing, but his jaw tightened. That night, he found Annie outside, sitting on the fence, looking out the sky. They don't want me here, she said. They don't know what they want, he replied, sitting beside her like a father would. I know why that man came, she said after a moment. The one in town. He's not a cousin. He's the one who burned the wagon. Thomas stared at her. What did you say? Annie didn't look at him. He was there. I saw him through the smoke. He took things from the bodies. Mama had a necklace. He took that. Thomas felt the heat rise in his chest. Why didn't you tell anyone? No one listens to little girls, she said. But I remember his boots. They were shiny, like he was going to church. It hit him then. The man in town wasn't a relative. He was a thief, maybe worse. And if Alton or Hanley were involved, this wasn't just about money. It was about secrets. Maybe someone had paid for silence, and Annie had seen something worth killing over. He had allies, but few he could trust. Eliza would help if needed. The old preacher, Miles, might too, though he'd lost his fire years ago. Everyone else either owed Hanley, feared Alton, or stayed out of things that didn't touch their doorsteps. The next morning, Thomas made a quiet trip to the church. Reverend Miles looked older than he was, stooped and gray, but his mind was still sharp. Thomas explained the girl's memory, what she said, and what might be coming. Miles sat in silence a long time. Then he said, You need to keep her safe. Don't rely on the law. I'm not. You think Alton knows what she saw? I think he suspects. And if he didn't before, he will now. Miles nodded, solemn. Then time's running out. Back in town, the wind shifted again. Eliza spotted the stranger in Hanley's office that evening, shaking hands. Hanley never smiled unless something was already won. Something big was moving behind the curtain. Alton hadn't shown his face again, which meant he didn't need to. He had others pulling strings now. By dusk, Thomas was back on the ranch, watching the horizon. His shotgun was cleaned and loaded. Annie sat near the fire, reading one of the books Eliza had sent over. She looked peaceful, but he knew better. That calm in her came from seeing too much too soon. She looked up suddenly. They're coming soon, aren't they? Yes, he said. Will you let them take me? No. even if they try to kill you?" He didn't speak for a long moment. Then he walked over, crouched beside her. "No one's taking you," he said, his voice steady like a father's vow. "Not alive." She nodded, then went back to her book. Not like a child, but like someone who'd already made peace with the worst of the world. And Thomas knew then, he wasn't just protecting her. He was standing between her and everything he had failed to stop once before. Spring came slowly that year, dragging its feet across the land like it wasn't sure it was welcome. The earth cracked less. The wind carried more warmth and grit, and a thin green crept over the brown hills around Thomas's ranch. Life, in its stubborn way, kept going, and for a while, it almost seemed like that was enough. Thomas noticed the changes in Annie first. At 10, she moved differently now, less like she expected to be grabbed or ordered around, more like she had her own space in the world and believed she belonged there. She started humming sometimes while feeding the chickens, soft and under her breath. She started laughing at the goat that kept escaping its pen. The first time she smiled, really smiled, was when Thomas, her father, taught her how to ride. The old gelding, Mudge, was patient and slow, perfect for her. She gripped the reins too tight at first, but Thomas showed her how to loosen her hold, how to move with the horse, not against him. "You gotta trust him," he said, walking alongside her. "And yourself." She narrowed her eyes. "I don't trust easy." Thomas gave a small grunt. "Neither do I." But she did. Little by little, she began to trust him as her father. She trusted that he'd be there when she woke up, that dinner would be hot, even if it was only beans and cornbread, that when he said she was safe, she really was. In turn, Thomas found himself doing things he hadn't done in years. Talking more, cooking better, fixing the front door so it didn't creak, like he wanted the place to feel like a home for his daughter. There were good days. Days when the fear fell away for a few hours. They picked wildflowers. She drew pictures with charcoal on feed sacks. He carved her a small horse from driftwood, and she kept it tucked under her pillow. In those small, quiet moments, something like healing started. But peace never lasts long in places like Dead Horse. Trouble doesn't always come with a gun. Sometimes it comes in a suit, with polished boots and a handshake. One afternoon, while Thomas was repairing a broken wheel on the wagon, Annie sat nearby reading when Eliza rode up in a hurry, her face tight. "You need to come into town," she said. "Now." "What is it?" She looked at Annie, then back at Thomas. "The judge moved up the guardianship hearing. It's tomorrow. And that man, whatever he really is, he's got papers claiming custody. Says he's her uncle." Annie's fingers clenched the pages of her book. "He's lying." "I know," Eliza said softly, "but he's got documents. A lawyer. He says her name is on a church record up in Colorado. Says her mother was his sister." Thomas stood, and the judge. Eliza hesitated. "He owes Hanley. For a lot." Thomas didn't say anything, just nodded once, tight and grim. That night, the fire burned low and quiet. Annie sat close to it, legs drawn up under her dress. Thomas sat in the old rocking chair, watching the flames move. "I don't want to go," she said finally, her voice small. "I won't let them take you," he said again, like a father swearing an oath. She looked up at him. "What if they kill you?" He met her eyes. "They won't." She didn't blink. "They kill my mama." She tried to stop them. I think she knew who he really was. He smiled when she screamed. Thomas swallowed hard. He reached over, placing a hand gently on her shoulder. "You're not her. And I'm not going to let what happened then happen again." Her chin trembled just a little. "Promise?" "I do." But he didn't sleep that night. He kept the shotgun close and sat at the window, watching the dark, waiting for headlights, hoofbeats, anything. When morning came, he saddled the wagon. They rode into town together. He made her wear her best dress, even though it was still a size too big. He'd shaved. He didn't say why, but Annie seemed to understand. They stepped into the courthouse just before noon. The stranger was already there, clean coat, clean boots, hair slicked back. He turned when they entered and smiled. Thomas saw it right away. That same cold amusement, that same sick twist at the corner of his mouth Annie had described. The judge sat like he had somewhere else to be, barely glancing at Thomas. The stranger's lawyer stood first. This child, Annie Porter, is the blood niece of Mr. William Hargrove. Her mother, Lillian Porter, was Mr. Hargrove's sister. Upon news of her passing, Mr. Hargrove traveled at great personal cost to reclaim his family. Any proof of this? The judge asked. They handed over a folder. Baptism records. Letters. A photograph of a younger Lillian standing beside a man who looked just enough like the stranger to pass as kin. The judge turned to Thomas. "Mr. Rourke, you got anything to say?" Thomas stood. His voice was calm, steady. "That man is not who he says he is. My daughter watched him rob her mother's body while it was burning. She remembers, and I believe her." The judge leaned back. "Belief and proof are different things, Mr. Rourke." Eliza stood up from the bench. "May I speak?" The judge sighed but nodded. "I run the mercantile," she said. "I saw that man come into town. He didn't ask about Annie's welfare. He asked how fast he could get her out of the county. He paid for that lawyer in cash. And he never once called her by name, just the girl." The stranger's jaw tightened, but he didn't speak. Reverend Miles stood too. "I know Lillian Porter. I married her to her husband 10 years ago in New Mexico. She didn't have a brother. She was an only child. That cracked something." The judge looked at the lawyer. "You got birth records?" "We have what's available," the man said, now a little less sure. "I'd like to speak," Annie said, standing. The courtroom went quiet. Her voice was steady for a 10-year-old. He was there. He took her necklace. He stepped over her body. I saw his face. The silence after that was thick. The judge cleared his throat. "We'll need to verify these claims. Mr. Rourke, you'll retain temporary custody until then." It wasn't a win, not really, but it wasn't a loss. Outside the courthouse, Thomas touched Annie's shoulder. "You did good, kid." She nodded. "He's not done." "I know." That night, Thomas locked every door. He sat with his rifle across his lap while Annie slept. Near midnight, the dog growled low. Thomas stood, heart hammering. He crept to the back window, just in time to see a flicker of movement near the barn. He stepped outside, slow, quiet, boots crunching gravel. Someone was there. "Don't move," Thomas called, raising the rifle. The man turned, hands up. It wasn't Hargrove. It was one of Alton's men, a farmhand who always hung too close to the saloon. "I was just," the man began. "You're trespassing," Thomas snapped. "And if you come back, I won't give warning next time." The man backed away, disappearing into the dark. By dawn, Thomas knew what was happening. They couldn't win it in court, so they tried to scare him off. Or worse, the stakes weren't just about Annie anymore. This was about keeping old crimes buried. Alton, Hanley, maybe more, whatever had happened to Annie's family had value, maybe land or gold, something they thought worth killing for. But Thomas wasn't leaving. And now, he wasn't just fighting for Annie. He was fighting for the father he'd become, the man who didn't run. They spent the next day reinforcing the cabin. Annie, at 10, helped nail boards, stack wood, and load bullets into the rifle belt. She didn't speak much, but her eyes were clearer than they'd ever been. "You scared?" Thomas asked. "Yes," she said, "but I'm staying." That night, she gave him the wooden horse he'd carved her. "To remind you," she said, "that I trust you, Pa." Thomas took it and felt his throat tighten. He didn't sleep that night, either. Neither did she. And somewhere, not far off, a fuse had been lit. The next morning came heavy and gray, clouds pressing low over the hills, and the air felt like it carried warning. The kind of day when even the animals stayed quiet. Thomas moved slow through his chores, always glancing toward the horizon, the road, the barn. Everything felt like it was holding its breath. Eliza showed up mid-morning, dust on her skirt, urgency in her eyes. "They're moving faster," she said. "I saw Alton ride into Hamley's office last night after dark. Something's coming. Maybe today, maybe tomorrow, but it won't be clean." Thomas nodded, jaw clenched. "Any word from the judge?" She hesitated. "He's gone. Left town this morning." Said it was church business in Santa Fe. That man Hargrove is still here, still walking around like he owns the place. Then we're on our own. Eliza looked toward the cabin where Annie stood in the doorway, holding the little wooden horse Thomas had carved her. She's strong, Eliza said, almost to herself. But don't let them make her strong the wrong way. Don't let her grow up thinking the only way to live is to fight. Thomas didn't reply. He didn't know how to. That night, the wind howled like it wanted to tear the roof off. Trees bent at the edge of the fields. Thomas sat at the table, cleaning his rifle again. Annie was drawing something at the other end of the table. She'd stopped talking much these last few days, but her presence was steady. When a knock came, it was soft. Too soft for a stranger. Thomas rose slow, rifle in hand, and opened the door, just a crack. It was Reverend Miles, soaked through, face pale. "They're coming tonight," he said. 3 men, maybe 4. Hargrove, too. Alton's staying out of sight, but this is his doing. They're saying it's a retrieval. A quiet one. Law know about it? Thomas asked. They are the law tonight. Thomas nodded once and closed the door. And he didn't look up. How long do we have? Not long. They moved quickly, securing windows, dousing lanterns, setting the traps Thomas had learned in a war he never talked about. He taught her how to shoot the pistol, just in case. She didn't blink. She just listened, learned, and nodded. They won't take me alive, she said quietly. They won't take you at all, he said, his father's heart fierce. By midnight, the wind had died. The silence was worse than the storm. And then, footsteps. One at first, then another. The crunch of boots on frozen soil. Voices low and tight, circling. A window shattered near the back. Thomas moved fast, firing a warning shot. Someone cursed and fell back. Another tried the door. Thomas slammed his shoulder into it, holding it shut as Annie slipped him the rifle. More footsteps, more shadows. Then a voice, slick and smug. Let the girl go, Rourke. You don't have the law on your side. No one's going to help you now. Thomas fired again. You want her? Come and bleed for it. Gunfire erupted. The cabin shuddered with sound and smoke. Annie stayed down, just like he told her. She crawled to the back room, keeping low. Thomas counted every shot. 3 men outside, 1 circling wide. He hit one in the leg. The man screamed. Another tried the window again. Thomas shot through a blind. Silence. Then boots on the porch. The door buckled, splintered. And then another noise. Hoofbeats. Fast. Someone else was coming. Shouts broke out. One of Alton's men screamed. It's the preacher. He brought folks with him. Then everything turned to chaos. Gunfire from behind. Screams. A man fled past the window, bleeding from the shoulder. Another dropped his gun and ran. In the confusion, Thomas kicked the door open and rushed out. Hargrove stood near the barn, pistol raised, yelling orders. He didn't see Thomas until it was too late. Thomas knocked him down with the butt of the rifle hard. The man went limp. By the time the smoke cleared, Reverend Miles stood with a half-dozen ranchers, guns raised, watching for movement. Eliza was there too, cheeks flushed, a pistol in her skirt pocket. Annie stepped outside, her small hand steady, eyes sharp for a 10-year-old. She looked at the blood in the dirt. She looked at Hargrove on the ground. Then she looked at Thomas, her father. It's not over. She was right. The sheriff arrived hours later, sober for once, cheeks pale as he saw the damage. You should have come to me, he mumbled. You would have come for me, or for them. Thomas asked. Dobbs had no answer. The town woke up different the next morning. They didn't say it aloud, but something had shifted. Alton didn't come out of his house. Hanley claimed he knew nothing. The judge returned a few days later, all apologies and smooth words. But nobody bought it anymore. The aftermath wasn't clean. Hargrove was taken into custody, but he'd bought too many people. Charges were slow. Witnesses changed their stories. Eliza tried to keep pressure on, but the system moved like molasses uphill. Annie didn't talk about that night. She didn't have to. The way she walked, the way she watched people, it said everything. Thomas filed paperwork to adopt her legally. It took weeks, But eventually, the papers came through. She was his daughter, and he was her father, and no one could change that now. But things had changed in ways deeper than signatures. Annie, at 10, had grown up fast, too fast. She still laughed sometimes, still sat on the porch drawing horses and birds and clouds. But there was a weight in her now, the kind that never really leaves. One night, Thomas found her in the barn, sitting in the hay, staring at the wall. "You okay?" he asked. She nodded. "I was thinking about Mama, about how she screamed." Thomas sat beside her, like a father would. "You don't have to remember that part." "I do," she said, "because she tried. She didn't run. She fought. I want to remember that." Thomas didn't know what to say, so he sat there with her, in the dark, with the horses shifting nearby, and let her memory breathe. Weeks passed. The land greened up. Crops came in. Life again did what it always does. It kept moving. But some scars don't fade. Some stay as part of you. Annie helped him with everything now: fences, bookkeeping, even dealing with traders in town. She stood straighter, spoke clearer. She didn't flinch anymore when someone yelled. But Thomas saw something else too, a deep fear buried behind her eyes. Not fear of men, not anymore. Fear of loss, of being torn away from her father again. One night, as they sat eating stew, she asked, "Why did you take me home that day?" "At the auction." Thomas thought for a long time. Then he said, "Because I saw myself in you. And because I was tired of walking away from things that mattered. I knew you needed a father, and I wanted to be him." She nodded. "I think I was supposed to find you." "Maybe," he said, smiling just a little. "Or maybe I was supposed to find you." The storm never truly passed in places like Dead Horse. But inside that small house, with walls rebuilt and hearts stitched back together by grit and time, there was something close to peace. Not the kind you read about in books. The real kind. The earned kind. But even peace has its price. And they'd both paid it. In full. The days grew longer, and though the warmth of spring had settled over the valley, Thomas felt the cold hadn't truly left. It clung to the edges of his thoughts, to the way he kept the rifle close at hand, even after the danger had passed. Annie had settled into something that looked like safety, but it was a thin kind, like a glass wall, clear, fragile, ready to crack if pressed too hard. She didn't talk about her dreams anymore, but he knew she still had them. He'd hear her stir at night, sometimes whisper, sometimes cry without sound. As her father, he never said anything when it happened. Just waited until morning and left hot coffee and bread on the table. One morning, she came in from feeding the chickens, her face pale, fists clenched. "I saw him," she said. "In town. Alton." Thomas looked up from where he was mending a saddle strap. "He say anything?" "No." But he smiled. Same way Hargrove did. Thomas stood, the strap falling forgotten to the floor. "We'll go talk to Miles." But she shook her head. "No, I want to talk to him. Annie, I need to pa." Thomas didn't like it. Every part of him said protect her, hide her away, keep her safe from men like Alton. But he saw the set of her jaw, the fire behind her eyes. If he said no, he'd just be telling her she was still too broken to stand on her own. And she wasn't. "All right," he said, "but I'm coming with you." They rode into town after supper, when the light was soft and the streets were quieter. The saloon lights glowed warm from within, laughter leaking out like everything was fine. Thomas tied their horses near the church. Annie walked ahead of him, her steps sure for a 10-year-old. Alton was leaning on the rail outside the saloon, drink in hand, boots crossed at the ankle. He looked older than before, sagging around the eyes, a little thicker in the middle. But his smile was the same, arrogant, unbothered. "Well," he said, raising his glass when he saw them, "the little survivor and the good Samaritan." Annie didn't flinch. "I remember what you did. I know you sent them." Alton laughed. "You're going to have to be more specific." "I've done a lot of things." "You let your men kill my mother," she said. "You paid Hargrove to shut us up." "Did I?" he said, sipping. "Funny. I don't recall signing anything." Thomas stepped forward, his voice low and rough. "You come near my daughter again, even once, and you'll disappear into the hills like dust. No judge, no law. Just gone. Alton narrowed his eyes. Is that a threat? No, Thomas said. It's a promise. They walked away without another word. And behind them, Alton's smile finally cracked. Just a little. That night, back at the cabin, Annie sat in the doorway, knees drawn up. She was shaking, but not crying. I hated how small I felt, she whispered. Standing there, I thought I'd feel stronger. You were strong, Thomas said, sitting beside her like a father. He still had all the power. He knew it. I knew it. Power doesn't last, Thomas said. Men like him build on fear. Fear runs out. She nodded, but something in her was still restless. The next day, a letter arrived. Official. From Colorado. Thomas opened it while Annie cleaned up after breakfast. He read it once. Then again. What is it? She asked. It's proof, he said slowly, of your mother's land claim. Her father had property, gold-bearing hills. She never filed because she was scared it'd draw attention. Annie blinked. Then why now? Hargrove knew. That's why he came. That's what they were after all along. Annie looked down at her hands. So it was about money. Not me. Thomas stepped forward. No, it was about both. You were the key to something they couldn't take any other way. What'll we do with it? She asked. We claim it, he said. Not because of the gold. Because it's yours. Your mother's. Annie was quiet a long moment. Then she said, let's go. They left the next morning, riding out toward the old hills west of town, where her mother once grew up. The land was wild and untouched. Pines lined the ridges, and a river curled through the middle like a silver ribbon. There was a marker, just a wooden post, half rotted, but it bore the old initials. LP, this is it, Thomas said. Annie stood for a long time, just looking. Then she knelt and placed her hand on the dirt. She used to sing to me about this place, she said. Said there was a tree shaped like a heart. Said she'd bring me here when it was safe. Thomas found the tree, bent from wind, its trunk curled at the base. A rough heart, carved into bark long ago. He didn't say anything, just watched Annie press her hand to it like she was holding something alive. That night, they camped beneath the stars. The fire crackled. Coyotes howled in the distance. Annie sat beside him, her knees pulled to her chest. She didn't run, she said softly. I keep thinking about that. She stayed. She stayed for you. Annie nodded. I think I understand now. What it means to protect someone. What it costs. Thomas didn't speak. The words wouldn't come. He just reached over and pulled her close, like a father would, and she let him. Later, lying under the stars, she said, when my mama died, I stopped believing in anything. God, people, family. But I think I believe in you, Pa. Thomas closed his eyes. That was the first time she called him that so clearly, and it hurt in the way healing often does. They rode back 2 days later, carrying the old documents with them. They met with Reverend Miles, who helped them file the rightful claim. Eliza offered to find a lawyer who wouldn't flinch under pressure. It would take time, but the land was now legally Annie's. Alton didn't try anything, not openly. But Thomas noticed he stopped showing up at town meetings. Hanley kept to himself. Word had spread that the girl he'd tried to erase had found her voice, and land worth more than any of them had guessed. Annie took over half the ranch chores that summer. She talked more, smiled easier. But Thomas saw the difference in her. She'd aged, not in years, but in weight, in knowing. And something inside her had finally settled. One evening, she asked him to walk with her down by the river. They sat on the edge of the water, skipping stones. Do you remember the first thing you said to me? She asked. Thomas smiled faintly. At the auction? I think I said you didn't look much like trouble. She grinned, and I said I was more trouble than I looked. You were right. They were quiet for a while. Then she said, I want to build a school. On the land. For girls. Ones like me. Thomas looked at her, heart full. That's a fine idea. I want them to know they're not alone. That they don't have to be quiet to be safe. He nodded. Your mama would be proud. Annie stared out at the water. You think she knows? I do. A week later, the judge returned. This time, sober, serious, and with new papers. Hargrove had been arrested in Colorado for unrelated crimes. The land case was closed in Annie's favor. Everything was legal now. No more shadows. When the news came, Annie sat with the paper in her lap for a long time. Then she stood and burned in the hearth. Thomas raised an eyebrow. "Why? I don't need proof anymore," she said. "I know who I am." And that was the turning point. Not the court victory, not the land, but that moment when she shed the last weight of needing to convince the world she mattered. Thomas knew then that his daughter was no longer just surviving. She was becoming. And in that, he found his own peace. They weren't blood. They didn't have to be. Some bonds were forged by pain, others by choice. Theirs was both, and stronger for it. Summer turned, and the land began to shift with it. Fields deepening into gold, trees heavy with fruit, and the scent of earth thick in the air. The old cabin on Thomas's ranch looked different now. Brighter. Annie, now 10, had painted the shutters white, planted flowers beneath the windows. It wasn't just a house anymore, it was a home. And that change had taken root in them both, father and daughter. Thomas no longer watched her like he expected her to disappear. She no longer flinched when a door slammed or a stranger passed too close. The silence that once stretched between them, heavy and uncertain, had grown warm. Comfortable. She laughed now. She teased him when he burned the biscuits or pretended not to care about the chickens she named after saints. The schoolhouse was coming along. They cleared a small plot on the hill above the river, marked it with stakes, and raised beams with help from Reverend Miles and a few of the town boys who respected Thomas enough not to ask too many questions. Annie had drawn the plans herself. She wanted a porch, wide windows, and books, dozens of books. Eliza sent crates of them from a distant cousin in Kansas City. One evening, after hammering the last of the siding, Annie sat beside Thomas on the porch, watching the sun melt into the hills. She leaned into him, her head resting just beneath his shoulder. "I thought I'd always be broken," she said. "I thought what happened to me would keep happening, somehow." Thomas wrapped an arm around her, like a father's embrace. "We all carry something," he said. "Doesn't mean we can't walk forward." Annie looked up at him. "Do you ever think about leaving?" He was quiet a moment. "Used to. Thought maybe there was more out there. But turns out I had to stop running to find it, to find you." She smiled. "I'm glad you didn't go, Pop. I'm glad you stayed." There was nothing grand in their love. No fireworks, no declarations shouted into the wind. It grew slow, like roots beneath the earth, quiet and deep. She began to wear one of his shirts when the nights turned cold. He started saving the last piece of pie for her, without pretending it was accidental. They didn't talk about marriage, not yet. But they both knew their bond as father and daughter was stronger than paper. On the first day of school, 3 girls arrived. All of them barefoot, dresses patched, hair braided rough. One of them clutched Annie's hand like a lifeline. Her name was Mary, and she had eyes just like Annie did when they met, tired and too sharp for her age. Annie knelt to meet her gaze. "You're safe here," she said, "and you're wanted." Mary didn't speak, just nodded. But she didn't let go. Thomas watched from a distance, his chest tight. He remembered how his daughter had looked when he'd first brought her home. Defiant, thin, waiting for the world to hurt her again. And now here she was, offering shelter to girls who knew that kind of silence too well. Later that night, Annie found an old tin box beneath the floorboard. Inside was the note her mother had written before she died. It was short, written in haste, but the message was clear: protect her. She's all that matters now. Annie held it for a long time. Then she tucked it into the book she was reading to Mary and the other girls, Little Women, with the edges worn soft from use. It wasn't about forgetting the past. It was about carrying it forward in a way that gave it meaning. That night, she and Thomas walked down to the river again. The moonlight silvered the water, and fireflies blinked between the trees. "Do you believe in fate?" she asked him. "No," he said, "but I believe in choices. We made ours. That counts for something." Annie nodded. She stepped into the water, boots and all, and turned to him with her hands held out. "Come on," she said. He grinned. "That water's freezing." Don't be a coward, Pa. With a shake of his head, he joined her. The river wrapped around them, cold and clean, pulling at the dust and heat of the day. She reached up and hugged him, quiet, sure, like she'd meant to for a long time, but had waited for the moment to be real. It was, and maybe that hug, that step into the river together, was the closest thing to baptism either of them had ever needed. Not of faith, but of healing. A start made new. By fall, the schoolhouse echoed with laughter and chalk scratches. The porch held more boots than it started with. And Annie, once an orphan sold at auction, had become something no one expected, a teacher, a protector, and a girl who no longer belonged to the pain that tried to define her. Thomas still fixed fences and fed cattle, but he did it now with the sound of children playing nearby and the smell of stew drifting from the windows. Every now and then, he'd glance at the ridge where her mother's tree stood tall and feel something like peace. The world hadn't been kind to them, but they had chosen kindness in return. And in the end, that changed everything.